Our guest today is Professor Salim Mansur of Western University. Hi, Salim. How are you?
Hi, Robert. Very well, thank you.
Good, good. When last we spoke, Salim, a couple of weeks ago, our video presentation was about Canada's foreign policy and how it has always been in the favor of the United Nations or Great Britain, and how we sometimes obey the dictates of the United States. And today, using that as a sort of a jumping off point, today I'm going to ask a question that was posed by Bob Metz on last week's Just Right radio broadcast, where at the end of the show, and the bulk of the show was about our conversation on Canada's foreign policy. But at the end, he posed a question that just got us both thinking about Canada as a nation. And he said the following, I'll quote him. Is Canada a nation in its death throes or a nation yet to be born? Given that we've never truly been an independent, mature nation because of our history, we may still be in the process of our political birth as an independent nation. Maybe not the one we expected. Or maybe Canada is a tragedy that will never reach its potential because its political parents are in the process of aborting their political child of freedom. Or worse, that Canadians themselves are committing national suicide, unquote. A profound question, because everything we're seeing today, Salim, from our foreign policy to statements from our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, saying that Canada is the first post-national state, that we have no core identity, that he has a certain affection for communist China and their tyrannical regime, and everything that is happening now with United Nations agreements on Indigenous people, on Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, our involvement overseas with the Ukraine-Russian conflict, all of these things coming together, not of course to forget the lockdowns and the violation of our charter rights by the Liberal NDP coalition government, which prevents millions of Canadians from getting on a plane or a cruise ship or a train. So I'm inclined to suggest that Canada is committing suicide, that we are, as Trudeau said, not a nation in the sense that a lot of countries in the world consider themselves to be full sovereign nations with their own national interests. But I want your opinion on it, Salim. What do you think? Is Canada in its death throes, or is it yet a nation to be born, undergoing some birthing pains in its last 154 years? What's your thoughts?
Well, I mean, to reflect upon the question that you've asked, to try to even frame an answer, I believe we have to go into our history, our origin, whatever date we want to choose, very recently, a few years ago, Quebec celebrated the 400th anniversary of the founding of the city of Quebec City, 400th Champagne and so on arrival. So the settlers arriving in the North American continent, of which Canada is an integral part, goes back to 16th century. So, going back to our origin, I'm talking about the white settlers, the people who came from Europe across the ocean after the discovery, quote unquote, of the New World following Christopher Columbus, 1492. So the settlement, the origin, the beginning on the Atlantic coastline and then moving inward. So going back to the origin, we need not go back all the way there, but somewhere back we have to go to start and ask the question to where we have arrived. And a good starting point would be the war between the British and the French Nouveau France and the British in the mid 18th century, culminating in the defeat of the French by the British in 1759 at the Plains of Abraham, and in that sense, the beginning of the history of Canada. We need to go back there and come right to our time. And of course, we're living through a period when these questions become extremely germane and pertinent, but the mainstream media is not going to talk about it. It's rarely talked about in any public square. It is not addressed by, as you correctly point out, by the people that are elected to represent us in Ottawa or any of the provincial capitals. And so there is no means by which either the public engages in these fundamental discussions that we are faced with as a result of the crisis that we are living through, the lockdown. It's unprecedented, isn't it, Robert? It is now, we are in the third year of lockdown we have entered, and quarantine, and our fundamental rights, whether we have it or not, at least on paper, those fundamental rights have been torn away. There is no answer. Our mobility rights, our rights to speak freely, talk freely, a right to, privacy, the most fundamental privacy. I mean, when it comes to, for instance, abortion, the answer is my body, my choice. But when it comes to vaccination, my body, my choice goes out of the window. And we have now almost, somewhere above 6 million people that cannot travel out within the country or outside the country, go outside the country as a result of not meeting the government requirements in terms of vaccination and all the other issues surrounding COVID-19. So here we are, a country of almost 40 million people, 5 time zone, the second largest physical country in the world after Russia. And we have, in a blink of an eye, become the largest internment camp in the world. And nobody's talking about it. Or those who are talking about it, talking about it from outside the country, but not within the country. There is no discussion. So yes, I mean, we have to ask those questions, Robert. Where do we begin? And Bob Metz's question is very important. My quick answer, I would frame it as, it is not about whether we are born or we are going to be born or where we have arrived. My quick question, my framing would be, looking back now from where we are at this vantage point, that Canada has been a vassal state right from its origin. And we can divide up that history in chunks, say from 1759, the making of the British North America, to the making of the Dominion, 1867. And then from 1867, as a Dominion within the British Commonwealth or the Empire, to the Second World War and the decade following the Second World War. So things became clarified in the immediate decade following the Second World War, that is the 1950s. So leading up to the centenary year, 1967, that could be one chunk period that we might want to reflect upon as a continuity of my thesis or proposition that Canada has been a vassal state and it remains a vassal state. As you say, post, what's the term that you use? Post-national.
Well, that was Justin Trudeau's statement that Canada is the world's first post-national state.
Local identity. So, and then from 1967, the centenary year, to where we are now with little wrinkles, but that's the other period, 60 years, almost 60 years now coming up. And if you look at that history, what I see, which of course will not be talked about and needs to be talked about, because is in what way we are a vassal state. What is a vassal state? A vassal state is a satellite, is a subservient entity. It doesn't have its own sovereignty. In other words, it is a dependency. And so what we have is Canada, and we have lived basically as a Potemkin democracy. That's the charade. We have lived it. We have bought into it. Many of us have believed it very strongly and passionately. We love this country. We sing the national anthem. We talk about ourselves as Canadians, as a remarkable people with a remarkable history that could be a model for the rest of the world, and there were prime ministers who talked about that, like Jean Chrétien. But when you start probing this idea of Canada from its origin to where we are now, probing it systematically and critically to understand why we are in this position, why we have a country that doesn't rally around the idea of freedom, that a fundamental right, everything begins with freedom. Are we a free country? Are we a free people? And we tested that. The Canadian people, a segment of Canadian people tested that earlier this year in 2022, in the winter of 2022, one of the coldest winters in recent years, with the Freedom Truckers convoy to Ottawa. And a lot of people basically outside of the central Canada rallied behind the truckers. Even central Canadians rallied behind the truckers. The convoy, the truckers convoy moved from British Columbia to the mountains and the prairies into central Canada. The convoys were joined by other convoys, and they converged and they headed to Ottawa. And then we saw what happened. It was a free demonstration of the people saying, no more. We want to assert our fundamental rights. We want to live our life the way we have lived before this COVID mandates were imposed upon us. We went along with it, but now we see that, this is not what we want. And what did the government do? It came down with the Emergencies Act, martial law. It arrested people. It used, jackboots of the uniformed agency, the law enforcement agency, and made a mockery of, on the 40th anniversary of the bringing of the Constitution, the patriation of the Constitution in April of 1982, by the father of the current Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, to which was added the Charter of Rights and Freedom. So this was the 40th anniversary this year. And on the 40th anniversary, this government, this parliament, because the entire parliament went along with it, basically tore up our Charter of Rights and Freedom. So these are very, very troubling times, and therefore it is only in a troubling time, in a crisis, ultimately, whether it is in the case of an individual or in the case of a nation, it is in a crisis that one can find out whether the nature of our body, our functioning, is working or is not working.
Let's talk about that, because if we were to compare our nation, such as it is, with any other nation in the world, I think the exemplar would be the United States. If you take that country, which has the only country in the world that starts off by saying that the people are sovereign. In Canadian law, it says that Parliament is sovereign over the people. Although in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it gives a nod to the fact that of the supremacy of God. And that's just simply to show that the rights that were delineated in that document are not given by people, that people have rights by their very nature, in other words, of God. But other than that, if we compare ourselves to the United States, in that federation, much like we are a confederation of states or provinces, no one state has sway or special privilege over any other. They each have 2 members to the Senate. Little Delaware, two members in the Senate. Mighty California, 2 members in the Senate. They recognized the state rights. Compare that to Canada. In our Constitution, when Newfoundland joined, for example, what was entrenched in the Constitution? Things like a ferry service. The federal government will provide a ferry service from North Sydney, Nova Scotia to Port aux Basques in perpetuity. It's in the Constitution. Newfoundlanders have the right to manufacture and retail margarine. It's in the Constitution. The Newfoundland Act, I believe it was called at the time in 1949. Things like that, the bilingual nature of New Brunswick and other provinces have guarantees and special rights and privileges that other provinces do not have. Our Supreme Court must have 3 members from Quebec because of their civil laws there versus the common laws in English Canada. 3 out of 9, 30%, 33% of the justices in Supreme Court, even though Quebec today only has about 20 to 22% of our population. They will always have 1/3 of the seats in the Supreme Court. This kind of comparison, if we are to take it, it seems like a shaky foundation, one that will crumble, one that can't stand, one that will not survive, given changing demographics. Quebec will be less and less of our population, yet they maintain more and more, it seems, control over the entire nation, whereby you're not going to get elected if you don't speak French. You're not going to get a fair hearing as an Englishman in the Supreme Court, surrounded by 1/3 always. And even now, our Supreme Justice, Richard Wagner, is from Quebec, of the civil tradition. So it does not seem to me that our structure, our Constitution, is in any way, shape, or form anything to be compared to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights of the United States and how it was made and stood the test of time long before Canada was created as a dominion. Your thoughts on the structures of this nation and how they will or will not stand the test of time, Salim?
Yes, yes. Your question takes us again. I mean, the way you have framed it, and quite correctly, takes us back to how did this come about? And you talk about the Constitution. The Constitution is something either given to you or you prepare it for yourself. So if it is given to you, then you are subservient. It goes back to being a vassal. And if you write it for yourself as an individual representing a group of people, then you are independent, or you're asserting your independence. In other words, you're a sovereign individual, you're a free person. So let me go back to that fundamental question, right to its origin, as I said. I will read you a sentence, a couple of sentences out of a letter written in 1858, addressed by 3 of our founding fathers, George Etienne Cartier, who was the Quebec lieutenant or French-Canadian lieutenant of Johnny MacDonald, Alexander Galt, and John Ross, 2 other members, written in 1858 to the British Parliament. remember the date, 1858. That's a decade before the Dominion was formed in 1867. And here is what I wanted to read to you from that letter. It will be observed that the basis of confederation now proposed differs from that of the United States in several important particulars. It does not profess to be derived from the people, but would be the constitution provided by the imperial parliament, thus remedying any defect. Let me reread it again. It does not profess to be derived from the people, but would be the constitution provided by the imperial parliament, that is, the parliament in England, thus remedying any defect.
So they thought it was a defect that the people of the United States created their constitution.
The defect that is being referred to is the American Constitution. Okay, so very simply put, a constitution that you write, whatever is defect, which will in the course of time you will correct, because you are a sovereign individual. You're asserting your sovereignty, and you're going to fight to defend the sovereignty. So a constitution of a free people and people asserting a sovereignty is going to be different, even if it has defects, and as those defects will be worked out in the due course of history of that people. In the American case, the Great Civil War. And then there's the Constitution that is given to you by another entity. So if it is given to you, if it is gifted to you in whatever, you are a dependency of the person who's gifting it to you. And I hope that clarifies everything. Let's go back very quickly. I mean, here it is. Cartier, who was a right-hand man of Johnny Macdonald, and therefore this letter had been consulted with Johnny Macdonald to the British Parliament, the mother of Parliament, and the Imperial Center. How did this letter come about then, and what it says of the intervening decades? So let's go back to, we said 1759, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, and the victory of the English forces over the French forces in that part of the world, Quebec. And with the defeat of the French, that was, in a sense, the defeat of the French Nouveau France in North American continent. They still had a presence. That presence would end subsequently when, during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon sold what is called the famous Louisiana Purchase in 1804 to Thomas Jefferson, and that brought the entire territory from the Gulf of Mexico, New Orleans, up the Mississippi River. You know, that's Midwest America. And that was a huge chunk of territory that the United States acquired after 1776. Well, so 1759, what happens next? What is a great event that happens next historically in the North American continent? It's 1776. The 13 colonies revolt against the mother country, you know, and that history is pretty well known, or should be well known, you know, the cry, no taxation without representation, the Declaration of Independence, in which George III was called a tyrant and a despot, and the right of man to be free of tyranny and assert itself, and so on. the 13 colonies on the Atlantic coast, the New England colonies running down the Atlantic coast to the Carolinas, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, rebelled and raised the standard of revolution to break away from the mother country. Well, Quebec was also, that is, British North America that became British North America, Canada, was also a colony of the same, George III, of the English. And the 13 colonies that rebelled made all sorts of overtures. George Washington made all sorts of overtures and people around him to get the people in the northern colonies along the St. Lawrence River and in the Maritimes, that was Nova Scotia primarily, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, to join the 13 colonies. And we know that eventually that did not happen. What happened was that the people along the St. Lawrence and in Nova Scotia, in a sense, rejected those overtures, given the back and forth that did take place. There are documents and letters that are available, and they were fascinating letters and documents. In the case of, for instance, Nova Scotia, the population of Nova Scotia in 1775, 76 was about 20,000 people. And one can divide them up and look at it, most of them were from New England, who have moved north as a result of, business and work. Most of them were in the timber industry, fishing industry. So loggers and fishermen, they moved up, and then the landowners, and 20,000 people. The capital was Halifax, so the main town was Halifax, where the money people were. And then people outside of Halifax, outside of the urban centers, 20,000. One group of people, that 20,000, wanted to join with the New England and be part of that revolution and the revolt. The other, that is the Halifax cabal, they were not interested. They were tied to London. They were the financiers. They were connected with the business headquarters in London, political headquarters in London, and they refused. They were the loyalists. And then another third, did not know what to do, which is what happens in most of the things. They would go whichever way was the winner, so to speak. So it was the financial interest that decided no. Same thing in what was Canada, that is down the St. Lawrence. The population in the colony of Canada, at that time it was still called Colony of Canada, was around about 90,000 people. And the main urban center was Quebec City, Montreal, and the village that was coming into being Kingston. And everything else was basically, settlements in the wilderness with the fur industry, the logging industry, and so on. And they were also under the thumb of the financial interests and the political interests, and they turned out to be the loyalists. So the population at the time, 90,000 along the St. Lawrence, 20,000 in Halifax. We were barely at that time 100,000 people, 110,000 people, add or subtract a few. The population of the 13 colonies also was in the same numbers. Collectively, the 13 colonies were about 2.5 million people. So if you divide it up among 13, just to get an average, it was about, 85,000 people in each of the colonies. But the 13 colonies they decided that they've had enough and they were going to assert their independence from the mother country and create a new state based upon the principles that were articulated in the Constitution that was written. They fought the war and they separated. And they went on their own way to create a new political entity in history that is a republican form of government. And we have the Constitution, we know what it is, we can talk around it and talk about it. But coming back to the British North America, as that letter point out, and that letter was written, more than a half century after the events of 1770s, the Loyalists wanted to remain one with the Mother of Parliament. And the history of Canada, therefore, since then is one in which our politics and our identity is entirely tied up with Britain. So in the first period from 1759 to 1867, and then you look at 1867, Robert, you open your BNA Act. I have a copy of it right in my hand. You open the BNA Act, and there is no reference as the Act opened, 1867. The opening passage of the Act is an Act for the Union of Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the government thereof, and the purposes connected therewith. And it goes on to describe the distribution of power and the institutions of government. You open up the American Constitution. Declaration of Independence is again part of that historical document, but you open up the American Constitution, which again I have, and it begins with the preamble. We have no preamble in 1867. It begins, we the people of the United States, we the people, asserting. Then it goes on to, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, etc., ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Two very profoundly articulated documents, and therefore two very profoundly different trajectory of history that happens then from 1776 to where we are right now.
And the writings in Canada at the time prior to Confederation basically talk about why the provinces should unite. And the raison d'etre of Canada was simply to be not American. It's like they banded together so that America wouldn't pick them off one by one. And of course, the three provinces at the time, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Canada, which when they joined became Upper and Lower Canada, or Ontario and Quebec rather. And then over the years, other provinces joined, mainly because they didn't want to be American. So what kind of a philosophy is that for the founding of a nation? We band together simply because we don't want to be like them. That to me is a recipe for dissolution in the future. It's a recipe for destruction. And to come to one of your points about the population, if you're figuring, for example, that it was only 90,000 people in maybe in the province of Canada who decided, to band together with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and that population measured in the tens to hundreds of thousands. Now we have 38 million people in this country. We have a union that we didn't really decide upon. Now, mind you, there are pros and cons. I mean, every generation doesn't mean that you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater or destroy the structures that were built by our founding fathers. No, but I think it's always prudent to take a look every generation at how we got here, what can we do better, and why are we still together? Is there a reason? Because now we're not American now. I mean, okay, that's proven. We're not American, great. But now you have Alberta talking separation. In the 80s, you had Newfoundland talking separation when the Supreme Court said that that province didn't own its headwaters to the Churchill to the Churchill River, which gave power basically to the northeastern seaboard of the United States and Quebec. And at that time, I remember that they wore black armbands. Flags were lowered to half staff because they lost that decision, and the people were polled, and more people would vote for outright separation in that province than the people in Quebec would have at the time. And that's in the 80s. And then you had the referendums in Quebec, whereby a cat's whisker, they voted to stay in Canada. So this country is built on quicksand, and I think that every now and then we need to revisit why we are a nation, if we are. Do we need to go together as a nation anymore? Do the same things that existed in 1867 exist today, which were the reasons at the time we became a nation? So I think that given the fact that we have a traitor as our prime minister, who has no allegiance to this country, who he himself said that he is a Quebecer and not a Canadian, I think that now's the time we have to discuss whether or not we should break this country up or revisit all of our fundamental structures and rethink it from the ground up.
Well, Robert, what happened in 1867, or how the country was put together in 1867, has a precedent. That is, the precedent goes back to 1776. And we not only have to be aware of that, but we have to take into account what it has meant in the way Canada has evolved as a vassal state. I maintain we are still a vassal state. We were a vassal state of the British, and then in modern times, after World War II, we became a vassal state of the Americans, that is, the American Empire. And we are headed into, or we have chosen to be now, in conjunction with the American, the vassal state of those who are pushing for globalism. So we have to be, in that sense, clear about what are we going to break from and break into, you know. If you're not clear about that, and if you're not clear about the problem, then it is simply building another mythology, you know, that we can break away Alberta or Newfoundland. I mean, Quebec has made 2 attempts through the referendum, and they've come very close to achieving their purpose through their 2 referendum. If they had gotten the majority before the Supreme Court made a decision after the 1995 referendum, that a simple majority is not enough. It has to be a substantive majority. The definition of what is a substantive majority might be up to the parliament to decide before.
That's interesting, Salim. Let me interrupt you there, because a little bit of history is that Newfoundland is the only province that joined with the referendum.
Yeah, correct.
And it only joined by a whisker's breadth as well, 2.3%, 52.3% on the second ballot referenda said to join Canada. So that at the time was only 150,000 people voting. So that was about 3,500 swing votes. And Newfoundland would have been back to its own original self, which is its own separate dominion. So again, it's very tenuous, that the ties that bind.
Yeah, I'm not clear about those who oppose in Newfoundland, those who oppose and lost the referendum on the question of joining Canada. Before joining Canada, Newfoundland was sort of an autonomous part of the British Empire, right? It was run.
It was a dominion for about 25 years, and then because of its debt situation, it voluntarily gave up its elected parliament to have a commission of government, where there was Newfoundlanders on that commission, I think 3, and British, and they ruled the Dominion at the time. And it was a Dominion in the same sense that Canada was a Dominion. It was as an equal member in the Commonwealth as Canada was, as a Dominion. And
Right.
the thing was that here's your deep state working again and your elites.
No,
When they had commission of government, they were promised that they would revert back to Dominion status before any other decision would be made on its future, and they did not do that. So the elites again destroyed the sovereignty of, such as it was, of Newfoundland.
right. So we're going back to 1949, 1950.
48,
That's when
yeah, was the referendum.
So again, that is the context, the circumstances of the time. I mean, if the people who voted against joining Canada had won, Newfoundland would have reverted back to being a dominion. And then the question would have been, is that something that the British wanted? Because by 1948, 49, Britain was transiting away from being the empire in which the sun never sank to becoming, in a sense, Britain itself becoming a junior partner of the emergent American empire. So what I'm driving at, there was a lot of thing at play, and so choice that Joey Smallwood made and his people made, that it is better to be part of the bigger market, America. I don't know whether there was a question on the table or a movement on the table that if there's a choice of becoming part of a bigger market, a more viable market, then why Canada? Why not America?
There was a lot of support for America at the time. As a matter of fact, there was an agreement between the Dominion of Newfoundland and the United States to have military bases there in Pleasantville and St. John's, basically, Fort Pepperell, I think it was called, and in Argentia. And thousands of Newfoundlanders joined, quite literally, with Americans. And there was a lot of trade with the United States, and there was a lot of sentiment to actually join the United States. But it was Britain who conned the Newfoundlanders by, when it was promised at the convention to say that, okay, we should have, go back to being a dominion and our own sovereignty, or continue with commission of government. Britain said, no, put Canada on the ballot too, because Britain didn't want Newfoundland. Canada didn't want Newfoundland. If you go through Hansard and the discussions at the time, Canada did not want anything to do with Newfoundland because it was a poor province and it would be a beneficiary of welfare, which it was. And that's why most of the rural part of Newfoundland voted to join Canada, was because of the baby bonus, the welfare. They were bought off. They threw their sovereignty away for a check. It's quite remarkable, the history. Now, this goes back to what I was saying before. History changes. These situations are no longer in effect. Newfoundland and Labrador is now a province, a have province, with all its riches and its oil. So do they want to revisit it? They will never revisit it because they are always very much, now with the schooling and that, they're very much in favor of being part of Canada. But my question still stands, I mean, times change, sentiments change, allegiances might change. So it's time for a revisit, not just for Newfoundland, but for the rest of the country, in my estimation.
Yeah, I mean, the last decades of the 20th century gave us the profile of what to expect in the future, that no state is, in a sense, immutable. They can all fall apart. The biggest, the largest, the second superpower, the most important country, state on the planet in the 20th century was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, Soviet Union. And it fell apart, it disintegrated. Yugoslavia disintegrated, Czechoslovakia disintegrated, Pakistan disintegrated, So there are enough examples that there is no such state that is ultimately immutable, and the fact that Canada has so many different cleavages and fishes that it is quite likely, not improbable, that a breakdown can take place, going into the future in the manner in which the country is being governed over the past many years. So that future looms ahead of us. But we need to go back, because the question that was implicit in your discussion of Newfoundland or Alberta, coming back to Quebec, is about the nature of Canada as a confederation. I mean, that was the 1867 Act, in 1867, it was Upper and Lower Canada, that is Quebec and Ontario, as the hub around which the maritime provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick came together. Those were the four provinces initially, and then subsequently was joined by PEI to become the Dominion of Canada, part of the British Commonwealth under the British Empire. Yeah, so in a sense, the thorn in the flesh of Canadian Confederation, right from the beginning, from the moment of the defeat of the French in 1759, has been the question of French Canadian in British North America, right? So before 1776, the British, having won and defeated the French, had to deal with this population, French population, by race, that is by ethnicity, language, and by religion, stands apart from the majority of the colonists, the settlers from Britain. I mean, the majority of the settlers, or the dominant element of the settlers in the Atlantic coast, New World, were from English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish that came across. And most of them were Protestants. These were the Pilgrim Fathers. This was the church. It reflected the English church, the Anglican church, or various other branches of Protestantism. But there was a common core linguistically, racially, and religiously. And then you had the French element. So in 1774, the Quebec Act was signed, and that created problem right across the British North America, that is including the 13 colonies, because in that act, the British Parliament basically recognized the place of Catholic Church as independent entity, and Catholicism gave them the right to tax, to raise kites from their followers, to run their own schools. And that recognition had ripple troubling effect for the other colonists, particularly in the 13 colonies, who felt that this was going to be extended. Another level of taxation would be extended upon them, on the 13 colonies. And that added to all the other problems that was raised that led to 1776, the revolution succeeds, and what the British are left with is the North American, the colonies on St. Lawrence, north of the 13 colonies. And then they go about, I believe it was the 1791 Act, in which Britain established the province of Canada, separating Upper and Lower Canada, Upper Canada being Ontario, and Lower Canada being what was Quebec. And that settlement gave, in a sense, power to, or responsibility to the people in Lower Canada, which was majority French-speaking, the right to conduct their affairs according to their own tradition, own laws, what later on becomes the Napoleonic Code in France, and that tradition is imported into Lower Canada. The role of the church and so on. So it was a way in which to balance off instead of raising the conflict. And yet there was conflict. There was a profound conflict going on between the moneyed interest, the powerful groups, and then the population. And you go forward in time and you come to the 1830s, the conflict, there is the rebellion, the Papineau Rebellion, the Mackenzie King, Lyon Mackenzie Rebellion in Upper Canada, the Papineau Rebellion in Lower Canada, and the British Parliament sends down Lord Durham to investigate it and find a resolution and so on. And in that famous report that Lord Durham writes is those lines. This is telling us, what the situation of Canada was as he investigated the situation, that he found that there are two warring tribes in the bosom of the state being the colony of Canada, the province of Canada, and Upper and Lower, and they are in conflict, in terms of all of the differences and difficulties. So the point, and without getting too deep into this history, the point is that right from the outset, the flesh in the thorn of the Canadian, eventually the Dominion and the Confederation, was that conflict between the English and the French, the Protestants and the Catholics, and that conflict has remained. It has gone through in different processes of change and evolution, but the fundamental has remained. As a result of the Durham Report, in 1840, the Act of Union was created, where what in 1791 had been making of Upper and Lower Canada was now joined together in the Union of Canada with equal number of seats, 40 for Upper Canada, 40 for Lower Canada, and they would meet, alternatively in Quebec City and in Kingston, and there would be the Legislative Council, and of course the Executive Council would still be the Parliament of Britain, to the representative, the Lieutenant Governor in Canada. So, and yet that conflict continues. It continues onwards, It is very fascinating when one goes back into all of this history. And the French factor being the one imposing upon the English the demands that the English have to accommodate, or otherwise the French will break out and go its own way. That separatism or nationalism was not something new that emerged in the period after 1967. It was, in a sense, always there, waiting to come up into the surface, Henry Bourassa, who was a nationalist, in mid-19th century, a contemporary of Sir Wilfrid Laurier, but he was a nationalist Quebecois, in a sense, the forefather of the modern separatists or nationalist forces in Quebec. And in questioning historians' note, he was asked, why is it that the Quebec French did not join with the revolutionaries, the 1776 revolution, when the invitation was there and the people were making all the efforts. There are stories about Benedict Arnold under George Washington leading a battalion of troops into Lower Canada. They had plans to storm the Citadel in Montreal, but that fell apart due to other circumstances and not because the English were ready to fight them at that moment or equipped to fight them. So the question to Henry Bourassa was, why didn't the French join? After all, 1759, 1776 is only less than 20 years apart, and the sentiment, the anti-English sentiment and so on. And Henry Bourassa replied, because we hated the English in Boston more than we hated the English in London. London was far away, so we hated the English in Boston.
Again,
Close by.
this comes back to me talking about why Canada formed at the beginning. It's because they did not want to be American. They hated Americana. They hated the notion of America, and they were always their feet were firmly planted in the old country.
Yeah, but the question again, we have to keep two things apart, two people apart. The English side of those who refused to join, that the money interests in Halifax, the money interests in Montreal, Quebec City, they were English. They refused to join George Washington and the 13 colonies. Because they were loyalists. They were not revolutionaries. They were Tories and Tory conservative. And it's a fascinating thing that Tory conservative and today's conservative are the same people in the philosophical sense, in the ideological sense. They are not freedom people. They don't respect liberty. They don't care about individual freedom, you know. I mean, this whole notion that is to be a conservative is to be one devoted to the idea of freedom, and there is no freedom unless it's based upon individual rights. The Tory conservatives don't believe in that. They don't accept that. For them, the parliament is supreme, within which the parliament being supreme and therefore sovereign, and the face of the parliament is the monarch. Yeah, today, the Queen, at that time, King George III, is controlled by and run by the landed interest. Toryism is landed interest, feudal landed interest. It is the Whigs. Whigs were the forerunners of the modern liberals. And we talk about classical liberalism. The Whigs were and are, in that sense, the defenders of freedom, individual freedom. Jefferson, Madison, George Washington, and so on. You know, I mean, all of that is wonderfully played out in the Federalist Papers. So Tory Canada, Johnny Macdonald's forerunners, were loyalists. They were loyal to the crown. But the French were not loyal to the British crown. They fought the British. And remember, in France, in the second half of the 18th century, we're talking about the period 1776 revolution and after. The French Revolution happened in 1789. Henry Bourassa is talking about giving the answer to a question in the middle of the 19th century. The French in Canada, that is Quebec, instinctively should be for their own freedom. But there is that, again, ambiguity, I would say, ambiguity in terms of their own psychology as a people, as a culture, that they were more or less more confident to make an alliance with the British in North America than join the revolutionaries, the 13 colonies, because intuitively, and this is what I am indicating or suggesting, intuitively felt that they would be assimilated into the revolution of America.
Well, doesn't this go back to what I said at the beginning, that in the American makeup, there is no state that has any more power than any other state. But in the Canadian makeup, what do you have? You have the French, Quebec, running roughshod over the entire country with special privileges and special positions.
Correct. That's the political arrangement, right? But I'm talking about in the sense of freedom issue. The American Revolution is about freedom. I mean, the Declaration of Independence is very clear. And then also in the Constitution, where America is today is besides the point in this particular discussion. We're going back in time. Mm-hmm. So America would absorb the French in Quebec into becoming Americans, and in becoming Americans, they would over time lose their linguistic identity and their religious identity, which would become watered down. I mean, there have been Catholic. After all, John F. Kennedy was the first Catholic president. The Irish are Catholics. And the Irish Catholics in America were and remain strongly opposed to British colonialism, because Ireland was a colony of Britain, and Ireland struggled for their independence with Britain right through, from Cromwell down to World War I, till Irish Republic was formed, you know. So we have all of these various ambiguities there. But it's interesting that the French in Quebec went along with the Loyalists to eventually create the partnership, Georges Etienne Cartier and Johnny MacDonald and the forces that they represented, to create in this partnership to establish the Dominion of Canada. And the Dominion of Canada would be a federation, a confederation. That's where your point comes in, you know, that in the confederation that was formed, Quebec emerged over time as the most important, even though numerically, you might say, or in any other way, Quebec doesn't have the same clout as now, say, English Canada together has. Quebec is barely one-fifth of Canadian population, 20% or less of Canadian population. And yet, numerically in the Federation, Quebec has a huge clout in terms of the number of seats, in terms of the Senate, in terms of the judiciary. And they have that clout because English Canada engaged in conceding to them on the bargain that Quebec would remain part of the Canadian Dominion. So when the history is written, as was written at the time of the first centenary of Canada, 1967, that is the history that Pearson launched, the Bilingual and Bicultural Commission, the Royal Bilingual Bicultural Commission. The history was written that Canada was founded by the founding cultures, which is British and French. This is, again, history is written by the winner or by those who want to set up their own mythology in contrast to facts and evidence. The facts and evidence is that Canada, the English, defeated the French in 1759. It was a defeat. And then after the defeat, they did what they did once the 13 colonies separated, you know, and became the United States of America. We end up with the subsequent history of English and French within the British Empire. And within that empire, the English, who were the loyalists, engaged in making those concessions. And here are the concessions. It is, again, not imaginary and fictitious. There's always been the question of representation and the powers that politics is all about, between different groups and segments of people within a state. But in the Federation, what became Canada, the states that made up the Federation were divided, as Lord Durham pointed out in 1830s. There were two warring tribes in the bosom of the state, that is English and the French. And so they would be jostling for influence and power. That was a given. But the test comes at a moment of extreme crisis. And there is no more extreme crisis in the life of a country and a people than it is war and peace. And so in the Boer War, in the First World War, in the Second World War. We are under the British Empire. The English rallied under the British flag as loyal to the mother country. And they went, what interest was there of Canadians or Canada in South Africa to go and fight the Afrikaners, the Dutch reformers, which eventually became the Republic of South Africa. That was a quarrel between London and the settlers in South Africa. And a predominant element of the settlers in South Africa from Europe were the Dutch Afrikaners. There was nothing, for anybody in Quebec or anybody in Toronto, Ontario to rally behind the flag. But the people in Upper Canada, in Ontario, rallied behind the flag. Quebec refused. But the greater crisis was World War I. And then you have the conscription crisis, that divided Canada. France was an ally of Britain. So if you think about it logically, France is an ally of Britain. Britain and France are fighting Germany. And French Quebecois, whose mother country, language, religion is French, France, refuses to have anything to do with that war, where English Canada is rallying behind the flag of Britain, because at that time, Canadian flag was still the British flag, the Union Jack. And the same thing happens in World War II. So as a vassal, as a satellite of the British, Canada rallied forth. That is
right, just because Britain had a treaty with Poland. Like, nobody cared about Hitler back in the day, really, and his domestic policies. They didn't care about Czechoslovakia. They didn't care about the Sudetenland. They didn't care about any of that. But when they marched into Poland, with which Britain had a treaty, all of a sudden, we're now at war, 2 years before the Americans even joined it. So your point is well taken. At that point in time, we just followed the lead of Britain. But we had no interest in Poland.
Yeah, but that's exactly what a vassal does, isn't it? The serf follows the Lord. The Lord says, we are at war with such and such. The serf says, tell us when to march, and we will march.
Jump, how high, sir? Yes.
And how hard, and so on. So that's the condition of the vassal. So the first, almost 150 years, going all the way back to 1759, Canada, what becomes Canada as a dominion, is a vassal, is a satellite, is a dependency of London, despite the fact that in this period, immediately after World War I, in 1926, there was the Imperial Conference in London, the Balfour Declaration. This is the Balfour Declaration dealing with the British Commonwealth, in which it was stated that the British Commonwealth constituted of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa are independent. Independent of what? Independent of the British Parliament. They have the right to make their own laws. Okay, that was 1926. To understand the meaning of that declaration, that one has to contrast that in a comparative sense with the situation of Britain and India. India was the crown jewel, not Canada, not Australia, not New Zealand. The ruler of India, that is the British ruler of India, the first of them, Victoria, was declared the Empress of India. She's the Queen of England and Empress of India. And her son, Edward VII, and his son, George V, who went to India to be crowned, were the emperors of India. Okay, so when in 1926, Britain declared through Balfour Declaration, Balfour, who had been the Prime Minister of Britain and then the Foreign Secretary of Britain, declared that from now, the British Commonwealth, members of the British Commonwealth, are politically independent entities. That excluded India. In other words, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. South Africa was a little messy situation because the whites in South Africa were the minority, and subsequently they would construct, after World War II, the apartheid state. But in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, these were white dominions of the British Empire.
So there was racism that decision, I guess.
Because the big event that happened after World War I was the Kamagatu affair, where Indians who had fought for the British, particularly the Sikhs, who had fought in large numbers for the British in Europe, apart from other Indians, they, because of the problems in India, as Indian independence movement began to unfold after World War I under Mahatma Gandhi, they who participated in these uprisings and got into trouble, they tried to flee India. So they went to Hong Kong, they got onto a ship, Kamagata Maru, and they sailed from Hong Kong to Vancouver. Where
they were rebuffed.
And they were quarantined. The ship was not allowed to unload the passengers. They stayed on the ship for a couple of months, and then the ship was sent back to Hong Kong.
Where a lot of them were killed.
There was disease, there was all sorts of problems, So again, this is the dominion, the satellite, the vassal state is a white dominion. And that is the contrast with India, which was the main crown jewel of the British Empire. So in 26, we became free, but Canadians did not accept that. Particularly English Canada did not accept that, because we did not have our own constitution, so to speak. Our constitution, that is the 1867 Act, was still in Britain, because we could not come to any agreement amongst ourselves how to manage that constitution. In 1931, at the Statute of Westminster, there was passed another conference in Britain, in which, again, Britain handed everything over to the British Dominion, and basically said, you are free now. And Canada did not have any agreement among themselves, and they did not go. So what was the question of the agreement? It goes back again to what you're talking about, the federation, the way that we were structured. And nobody was happy with it. Nobody was satisfied with it. And the reason also simple, as I read to you that opening letter, that this constitution was not going to be one prepared for in the name of the people of Canada, because there was no people of Canada. It was something that would be given by the Imperial Parliament to Canadians. And what was given is this confederation, which was again a charade, because what we had, if you go back into the 1867 Act and you look at it carefully, there is those federating units. Manitoba would join the Dominion in the 1870s. Then in the beginning of the 20th century, you would have Alberta and Saskatchewan join it. British Columbia was already there. And in the East, Prince Edward Island would join the Dominion after the Dominion was established in 1867. And then in the 20th century, middle of the 20th century, Newfoundland would join the Dominion, and that would complete where we are today. But the burr, the thorn, was and remained Quebec. Mm-hmm. Quebec was going to be appeased, or Quebec would be accommodated as a special status. And so Quebec was given those consideration. We have a Senate that supposedly represent, technically, it is supposed to represent the federating units. The parliament, the House of Commons, represents the people based upon the demography. And the Senate, the upper chamber, represents the federating units. Well, what do we have? We have an unequal Senate, you know,
well,
right from the get.
It's not entirely unequal. Just to lay it out there, out of 105 Senate seats, 24 go to Quebec, 24 go to Ontario, 24 go to the 4 Western provinces, 24 go to the Maritimes, 6 to Newfoundland, and 1 each for the territories. So there is some sort of attempt, at least, of making it equal rather than by population. Similar in the United States with 2 senators per state, regardless of population. And there's 24 per region, regardless of population. So there is an attempt, at least, of having some sort of equity in the Senate.
Well, you know, I mean, that's always been the argument. You know, we have regional representation. We don't have the representation of individual federating units. You know, if you look at it from the terms of regionals, there is that semblance of equality. But 4 Western provinces together equals 1 central province, Ontario. 4 maritime provinces together equal 1 central province, Quebec. And so 1 central province can veto, in a sense, by numbers, any of the combination of the others. You know, that's where the issue of equality comes into play. The optics is, yes, there is a regional equality, you know, but that optics is immediately, you know, can be punctured when you look at how the Senate works, what interests that they represent, you know, how the Senate is appointed, who appoints them, you know, and therefore the people sitting in the Senate, who are they beholden to? The Senate is not elected, so it doesn't represent even the regional people, the Maritimers or the Prairie or, you know, the Western provinces together, because they're not elected. They're appointed. They're appointed by who? The central government, the federal government, the head of the federal government, ultimately the one person, the prime minister. And so it's beholden to the prime minister and to the political party that the prime minister represents. Okay. Effective? Well, given the nature of the makeup means there is no effectiveness.
Well, constitutionally, they are.
Well, the effectiveness on the paper is that you can have a legislation coming down from a bill coming down from the Senate, right?
Because they can initiate bills and they can also overturn bills and send it back to the lower house. They have the power, Salim, but they choose not to exercise it because they're not elected. And I've always maintained that Supreme Court justices aren't elected either, yet they have no qualms about asserting their authority. So the senators should as well. And I have to give a kudos out to the senators, because it was because of our Senate that Trudeau withdrew the Emergencies Act a few months ago, because he polled the Senate when they were in discussions. After 15 hours of discussions, the PMO polled the senators, finding out that I'm going to lose this. They're going to not approve the Emergencies Act. So he revoked it. So the Senate has power, and I'm glad it had power back in February.
Yes and no.
Yes,
from my perspective, I mean, Senate has the power, provided those power is in some ways ratified by the Prime Minister's office, PMO, because the Prime Minister's office is making the appointments to the Senate, you know, and so there is that relationship. In the last two governments, the conservatives under Harper and now the liberals under Justin Trudeau, we have a number of anomalies that we can talk about, and that would take us in a different tangent. I mean, remember Harper, for reasons that still remains, open to question, left more than 24 seats unfilled when he stepped down, and that is befuddling to people. I mean, if the Senate had the power, then the Conservative Party representation in the Senate would have a clout, which Harper did not, fill. In the case of Mr. Trudeau, he came to office in 2015, trying to be the one recalling Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier's words, we will have sunny ways. We are going to be transparent. It'll be joyful, the big bad wolf is gone. That is Harper and the Conservative. And one of the things that he did was that he was not going to make appointments, and let the provinces and others propose. And immediately there were a group of senators, liberal senators, that moved on to sit as independent. And so on, and he was not going to impose any sort of a whip, a liberal whip on the senators to vote according to the demands of the Prime Minister's office. So that was the condition. Maybe now he's going to have a second thoughts after the events of February, March, surrounding the Emergencies Act. If the story is correct that the count before the senators voted was going to run against the House of Commons.
Well, I watched a lot of that debate, Salim, and yes, the narrative at the time did not look favorable on the Liberal government. And I think, by the way, there are still, if I'm not mistaken, about 14 seats still vacant in that House.
Right. But coming back to the principle, you go back and look, this was designed in 1867. It has remained so 160 years later, almost counting, what it is the Senate, in effect, not in the charade, the Potemkin Senate, but in effect is subordinate to the House of Commons on just about every way in the manner in which it is structured. Yes, so there it is. Unlike the U.S. Senate, the U.S. Senate carries the clout of not only the elected members of the Senate, of who they're representing, but it also carries the clout that those senators are representing their states. And in the recent time, in this very peculiar situation of the Biden administration and all in Washington, we have had a number of occasions because the Senate is divided 50-50. And so if there is a stalemate in the Senate on voting, then the vice president, the president pro temp of the Senate, will cast the decisive vote, to break the 50-50 stalemate. But on a number of very critical votes, in recent time, over the past year, the 50-50 vote did not happen on legislation because the senator from West Virginia, Senator Manchin, who is a Democrat, voted with a Republican. Also, Senator Sinema from Arizona voted with the Republican on some critical issues dealing with budget and dealing with the Green New Deal. These two, because Senator Manchin comes from West Virginia, which is a coal state, and that's state voted overwhelmingly both in 2016 and in 2020 election for Donald Trump. And given that vote in the two presidential election, the senator, who's a Democrat, had to take into account the opinion and interests of his state, and did not vote with Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, according to what Chuck Schumer wanted. He voted to represent his state. We don't have that situation in Canada. I mean, has there been in this counting into 3 years of lockdown and like any single province of Canada, the premier of Canada, that province, along with the senators from that province, however they were appointed, just for the simple sake of argument, that a senator from Alberta is in the Senate of Canada to represent foremost Alberta's interests, because that's the purpose of the Senate. So in this lockdown period, have we seen any vote in which a province and its senators have voted to challenge the mandate, the manner in which the mandate has been imposed, the question of the fundamental rights? None.
Well, the difference between the American and the Canadian Senate is fundamental in one respect, in that in the American Senate, they're subject to being reelected. The Canadian Senate, they don't have to answer to anybody because they're there until they're 75.
Precisely. So there you have it. I mean, you have the senators that are basically deck of cards in the pocket of the prime minister, and he puts on the table the senator he wants. If he's a conservative prime minister, he puts his cards down, and if he's a liberal prime minister, he puts his cards down, and so on. And there it is. And so we go back to then the argument, which is a fundamental argument. The design of this Senate and its role is baked in the cake. That is the 1867 BNA Act. And the BNA Act, it is baked in that cake where it is a centralized government. What is the model of the BNA Act? The model of the BNA Act is the British Parliament. What is the British Parliament and what is the British system of government? It is a unitary state. Britain is not a federation. It is a unitary state. So we are a federation. The optics of the federation is in the manner in which the distribution of power and everything has been done. But it is the cabinet and the prime minister which runs the show.
Oh, true. I mean, we have no checks and balances in that respect. I mean, in the United States, you've got not only the lower house, the upper house, of course, and the administration and the judiciary. Here you have basically the prime minister. Yes, there is the judiciary, and we are holding out hope as we speak that they will protect our rights when it comes to the actions of that prime minister in the last few years. But again, they're appointed by the prime minister of the day as well. And I think right now there's at least 5 Harper appointees and 4 Justin Trudeau appointees. The Chief Justice being appointed by Harper as a judge, but by Trudeau as the Chief Justice. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see. I'm sorry, Celine, go ahead.
Who comes from Quebec? I mean, Chief Justice Wagner.
Richard Wagner is a Quebec jurist, yeah.
So we go back into the structure, and my thesis, so to speak, my proposition is Canada is a vassal state. So by structure, it was designed, willingly it was accepted and adopted, and through this period of time, from 1867 till the end of World War II, we were loyal to England, the mother of Parliament. That is our pride, that is our identity, and that also served the purpose in terms of argument that we are not Americans. We are different from Americans. We are a traditional society. Our system of government is parliamentary, and our loyalties and the umbrella under which we operate is British. Then comes a transition period after the end of the Second World War, and the sentiments of the Canadian people, which is still pretty much Canada is a white nation, French and English, or Caucasian nation, French and English. The sentiment is still very much tied up with Britain. I mean, the war has ended, the war, Germany has been defeated, Britain still remains the empire, at least from the perspective of Canadians and the Canadian elite. And we are not only celebrating our victory, this is going to be the second end of the first century of the Canadian Dominion. We are entering the second century. And in all of that hoopla, what we do not see and do not want to see, or we do not comprehend, and we're coming back to the elite now. Canada was built by the elite. Again, it is not a reference to the people in the Constitution, in the letter that I read to you. So it was elite fabrication. It is high tourism, high Tory politics. That is what Johnny MacDonald was, and so on. And so in that context, the elite is still very much, and so we call them the Laurentian elite, still very much British oriented, and they are blinkered. They don't see that Britain itself now is giving up on the empire. I mean, it began with the independence of India and is rapidly moving, and through the early 50s, it is handing over power. I mean, in the case of Newfoundland and Canada, and the reality is coming home. The empire is over. Britain has been weakened by the two world wars, that it cannot sustain that empire anymore. And the leadership is now passing over. In fact, the leadership passed over during the famous meeting between Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt in Newfoundland. That was the signing of the Lend-Lease Act, the agreement with Roosevelt to support the British, with arms and ammunition. This is 1940. And so that is, in fact, the beginning of the changing of the guards. It is America now that is the rising power, and it'll be the age of American empire. American Republic is becoming weakened in terms of its philosophy, and it is an empire that is rising up. So the elite is not fully comprehensive of that. And the man who is the prime minister at this time in the 50s is John Diefenbaker, having won two massive majorities. The first one was huge and massive, with Quebec voting for him, and that's another interesting dimension because of Quebec nationalism and Quebec interests. And they are not voting with the Liberals, they voted for John Diefenbaker. And Diefenbaker and his people are uncertain, or they're still loyal Britishers. They're very much under the fidelity and attachment to Britain, and particularly John Diefenbaker himself. But things have changed, and that thing that have changed bubbles up to the surface with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that brings the end to the Diefenbaker government. Diefenbaker hasn't comprehended how massively the world has changed at the end of the Second World War in terms of British Empire and the rising American empire on the one side, and on the European side is Europe divided with Soviet Union army, down right through the middle of Germany, a divided continent. And it is in that context the position of Britain. So the Cuban Missile Crisis. What happened? We don't need to go into details, but the point is that Mr. Diefenbaker did not fully comprehend that Canada had become a buffer state between Soviet Union and United States. With the coming of the Sputnik in 1957, the making of the interballistic missiles, the nuclear age, and so on. So Mr. Diefenbaker abandoned the production of Avro Arrow jets, that had begun, that was in its time and place considered the most attractive, most effective, most powerful in sense of its purpose, its avionics as a jet plane, the Avro Arrow, but there was no buyer for Avro Arrow. Mr. Diefenbaker's government could not sell the Avro Arrow to the Americans or to the other members of NATO that had come into being in 1949. And he could not sustain the expense. His government couldn't sustain the expense of carrying the Avro through and maintaining it. And so he scrapped it. And in turn, he bought the Bomark missile from the Americans for the new situation we were in, that could be fitted both with conventional warheads and nuclear warheads. It was going to be Canadian. This was after NORAD was signed in 1958, I believe, the North American Defense Pact. And Canada was at the center of that. I mean, Canada, United States. And the issue that surfaced was, if it is going to be nuclear warheads, it would be under American control. And the Diefenbaker's government was divided upon it. And Mr. Diefenbaker got divided upon this. His foreign minister, Minister for External Affairs, Howard Green, was adamant that it must be under Canadian control. This is the question of sovereignty. And his defense minister, Douglas Harkness, if I remember the name correctly, was very much committed to seeing that Bomark carries a nuclear warhead and the Americans have control over it. That's no problem, because Canada was, as a member of NATO also. That became an election issue, and Mr. Diefenbaker lost in 1963. So you look back upon it. Mr. Pearson became the prime minister, the minority government, and then it moves on. With Pierre Trudeau becoming the prime minister in 1968, etc. But that critical moment, 1962-63, brought to the surface the question of Canada's sovereignty. And that public debate, which should not have happened from the point of view of optics, if Mr. Diefenbaker understood the situation, he would possibly not have gone into the election by raising these issues in the manner in which it was raised. And therefore, the North American media basically trashed Mr. Diefenbaker, supported Mr. Pearson, and that was the end of Diefenbaker government and eventually his own leadership. The reason it happened was Canada could not make its own decision on the most fundamental issue of a sovereign state, war and peace, as it could not and did not make the decision in the previous wars. 500,000 people of Canada, that is from English Canada, went to war in World War I. Nearly 1 million people, more than 1 million people was mobilized, but 1 million people went to war in the Second World War, again from English Canada. The father of this current prime minister did not go to war, he was from Quebec, just as most Quebecers did not go. There was no conscription, but English Canada responded. So that was under the umbrella of the British. Cuban Missile Crisis clarified that Canada had moved now under the umbrella of the Americans. And what NATO says, what Americans said on the issue of war and peace, Canada has to march under that flag. And which is where we are with the Ukraine issue. There is no Canadian national interest involved in Ukraine. There has been no discussion in the parliament. In fact, the discussion, if there would be in the parliament on the Ukraine issue and our involvement in it and support for it, that is the Kiev regime, would be basically a charade, because all the 338 members are wearing the Ukraine flag on the label. There would be no dissent allowed. The mainstream media would tear them apart, calling them, Russian puppets and Putin stooges, instead of having a real mature adult debate and discussion, asking those fundamental questions. What is our interest? What is the backstory? Why is this happening?
Well, let's go back, Salim, to our fundamental question in this discussion before we wrap it up. And that is, I take it as I'm in agreement with your assessment that Canada has and always has been, and always has been a vassal state of some other superior power. That's, I think, pretty much demonstrable in our history. Right. So if you had any advice to give to Canadians as a whole or to the elite who have to see us through the next 50, 100 years, what would that be? Maintain ourselves as a country? Dissolution? What would you change that could put us, salve the French-English debate? Your advice?
Well, domestically, that is, our political structure needs some very serious readjustment reforms. If you're going to begin in some ways to assert ourselves as a sovereign people, and among those, I mean, we have talked about it. This is on the table since the 1990s with the Reform Party agenda that was brought forward by Mr. Preston Manning about elected, effective, and equal Senate. I mean, that is one set of reform that we need to revisit and really engage in. I mean, in my opinion, there was a great betrayal when the Conservative Party that was a product of the amalgamation of the Reform Canadian Alliance with the Progressive Conservatives in 2003, and which led to the election of Mr. Harper as Prime Minister in 2006 to 2015, that there was a great betrayal, that Mr. Harper dropped the ball on this issue, which was the Reform Party's principal agenda in constitutional terms. Mr. Harper just walked away from it. And this is where the frustration is in Western Canada with the rise of, as you have noted in your opening remark, the separatist sentiments in the prairie provinces. And then we have also added to that the rise of the separatist sentiments in the Maritime, particularly in Newfoundland. I mean, Newfoundland is a resource-rich province in terms of water, Labrador, mineral, and fossil fuels in the offshore, that because of the federal government and its policy, it is Newfoundland and then the prairie provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, cannot exercise their provincial right, which is in the question of resources, resource management, education, health. These are all provincial issues in the BNA Act, and yet, the provincial governments have not been able to exercise their jurisdiction. And so that discussion has to be revisited if you're going to try to assert it. Then in the parliament itself, I am the view, and I think I'm not alone in this, Canada is the only major country apart from the mother of parliament, that is Britain, and India, which is the world's largest functioning democracy. We are the only parliamentary system of government that has the first past the post system election. In my view, it is the expiry date is long gone. We need to dramatically confront the problem of this first past the majority system and become a much more democratic parliament that is bring an entire PR system, proportional representation, or some sort of a mix system between the first past the post system and a PR system.
What about a ranked ballot, Salim? Discussion has been going on about that, and there are merits to it. As a matter of fact, Justin Trudeau has just recently commented about a ranked ballot, which he is in favor of, and he's not in favor of PR anymore. What's your thoughts on that?
I am very suspicious about not only the mechanism of ranked ballot, but the outcome of ranked ballot. We have seen it in if you want to say, a laboratory test of ranked ballot in a confined environment, that is the leadership race in the Conservative Party, and how the ranked ballot basically stole the election from Maxime Bernier, because you can rearrange the way to go after the person that the people who actually hold the power can nullify that vote. So no, I am very skeptical, and I think it's simple. I mean, look, the European system and all the major system, America is a unique system. Republican system is a unique. So, right here if you go into the constitutional discussion about it, it doesn't matter, Democrats and Republicans, the congressmen, the senators, they stand up ultimately, not only as a party members, but as individuals, their constituents, there is a built-in checks and balances in the Constitution. The fact that it has not been used properly over the last several decades, that's a different question, but the mechanism is there, and it stands apart. But in a parliamentary system of government that we have, it is now pretty much worldwide, and it is at the heart of it is in Europe, the proportional representation. What proportional representation does is give voice to everybody. That is, nobody is excluded from it. Once they have met, that is, the political party has met that threshold requirement to have an elected member in the parliament, whatever the threshold requirement is, 4% of the vote, 5% of the vote, and so on and so forth. In Israel, I think it is 5 or 6% of the vote that a party has to get. That's the threshold to be able to be given a seat in the parliament in terms of the numbers of votes. Germany has similarly, I think, 5%.
I think, Salim, you and I are going to be at odds over the proportional representation thing. You and I have had discussions about this before, but just to advance the conversation, you've talked about the upper house reform, you've talked about the lower house reform. What about the inevitable fact that our sovereign, who doesn't even live in the country, is 96 years old, and the crown is going to be handed to somebody who is political, who I think cannot keep his mouth shut and act in a kingly way, as he should? Would you advocate for a made in Canada sovereign?
I agree with you. I mean, if one remained an old Tory, old conservative, then one will say, we need a monarchy, we need a crown, and that is what gives stability. Governments come and go, but the continuity is the crown, is what Walter Bagehot in the English Constitution called the dignified face of the Parliament. That rallies the people, and so the function of the crown is very important in that sense, which is what the British system of government represents. But Britain has a history that is, again, like America, is unique to itself. We imported the British system of government in Canada when Canada was pretty much a white country. I'm not talking here necessarily in terms of racial or ethnicity, simple historical facts, and we imported that. There was no question about it. There was no debate about it. There was a complete agreement about it. And we have run through that whole issue that once the 1776 revolution was rejected by the loyalists in the North. Our history was patterned by our connection to the imperial parliament, to the motherland, which for the English was Britain. Okay, but 160 years later, we are not the same country anymore. For good or bad, better or worse, Canada is a much different country. You know, this constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedom speaks of Canada as a multicultural country. You know, so in a multicultural country, Mr. Trudeau's observation, we have no core identity. And if we go with that argument, neither you nor I necessarily accept that argument. We have a core identity. If we are a people who are freedom-loving, people who want to affirm and assert our independence, we have a history, and a history that is very distinct, with its blemishes and its stain, but its achievements also. Canada is a peaceable kingdom and could be a peaceable kingdom, quote unquote, in a manner in which our sovereignty we can protect and defend and have relationship with others based upon a clearly defined national interest. But this country as multicultural, as defined now by Pierre-Elliott Trudeau and all the subsequent prime ministers, and most of them have come from Quebec. The bulk of our prime ministers have come from Quebec, which is another anomaly. The question then becomes, who won the 1759 war? Did the English win it or did the French win it, you know? And these are difficult questions that we don't want to ask in public, and we dismiss it by anyone asking these questions as a bigot. So this is where we have arrived. We cannot deal with issues that go to the heart of our history without turning those issues into ad hominems, you know, which is a reflection of the weakness of us as a people. And the weakness of us as a people is we are a vassal people. We are a subservient people, subservient to people with power beyond us and outside of us, run by their lieutenants, their compradors, their mercenaries, which is, in the case of Canada, the Laurentian elite. And a cartelized economy, a crony capitalism. We are a branch plant economy of Britain in the first phase of our history, and a branch plant economy today of United States in the second phase of our history. And we hope to become a branch plant of the globalists going forward. You know, we haven't talked too much about it. But having a British monarch as a Canadian monarch constitutionally is a confirmation that we prefer to live as a vassal state. We'll only become sovereign and independent when we have our own sovereign leader, a leader who we consider sovereign, one of us. You know, that's how I would deal with it. Nothing to do with Britain and its monarchy. It's for them to choose. The example here is the example of India. India was the crown jewel once India came under British rule, and the British rulers were given the title Empress and Emperor of India. So in 1947, when India became independent, Indians were faced with the choice of whether India will continue as Canada and Australia and New Zealand were doing, with constitutional head being the Crown of Britain. The choice was given. Existed. Indians faced that choice. The first Viceroy and Governor General of India was Lord Mountbatten of independent India. But then the constitutional fathers of India, in preparing the Indian Constitution and putting it to vote, did away with the crown. You know, India became a republic. And the head of the republic, India maintained the British parliamentary system of government. but the head of this republic would be an elected president. And that elected president would be elected by the Indian parliament and the provincial assemblies together. So the president of India is elected, but is not elected, as in the case of America, by a free vote of the people. It is to the indirect vote of the people as represented by the members of the India's parliament and the provincial state governments. So it is an Indian institution now. The head of India is a free sovereign country, and it is a head, and it is demonstrating its sovereignty right now as you and I speak on the question of Ukraine.
Yes.
It is not taking a subordinate position to Britain, Boris Johnson, or to America, Biden. It has taken its position as India took during the Cold War. India did not join either the American or the Soviet camps. It was a leader of the non-aligned countries. Again, for better or worse. In politics, there is no black and white, it's always gray, But India chose to walk that path as a free, independent, and sovereign state. And I find the oddness, the anomaly that Canada, of being one of the oldest democracies in the world, has continued, its people have continued, its leaders have continued to prefer being a vassal state than by becoming a self-respecting, independent and sovereign state.
Why don't we leave it there, Salim? We've covered a lot of history in this 2-hour conversation. It's fascinating. And I only wish that there was more public debate about this. But you don't see it on the mainstream media. And I don't think you see it in the schools, at least not to the degree and to the depth that a person like yourself can get into. And so perhaps another conversation should be forthcoming to flesh out a little more of what we discussed today. So let's leave it there. Thank you very much once again, Salim. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert.